Before Rome became an empire, it was founded by two brothers who were raised by a wolf, born from a rape, and grew up to murder each other over a wall. Then those same people kidnapped an entire town's worth of women just to survive. And somehow, this became the most powerful civilization in human history. If that doesn't sound insane enough already, wait till you hear what they did to each other for the next 1200 years. It didn't actually start in Rome. It started 25 kilometers away, in a small city called Alba Longa. And in the year 771 BC, something ugly happened there. The king, a man named Numitor, was overthrown by his own younger brother, Amulius. And to make sure nobody could ever challenge him for the throne, Amulius killed every single male heir in the family. But there was one person he couldn't bring himself to kill: Numitor's daughter, Silvia. So instead, he gave her a different kind of punishment. He forced her to become a priestess, which meant she was never allowed to marry, and she was never allowed to have children. For a while, that plan actually worked, until Silvia got pregnant anyway. And when people asked her how, she said Mars, the god of war, was the father. Nobody believed her, obviously. But it didn't matter, because now there were two baby boys alive who had a real, legitimate claim to the throne: Romulus and Remus. So Amulius made a decision. He ordered his men to drown them in the river. Except the babies didn't die. Their basket floated down and washed up on the riverbank. And instead of finishing the job, a wolf found them, and she raised them like they were her own. Years passed, and the twins grew up strong. Stronger than most grown men, actually. And one day, they finally learned who they really were. They weren't orphans. They were the rightful heirs of Alba Longa, the same family their uncle had tried to wipe out. So they went back. They overthrew Amulius, and they put their grandfather back on the throne, right where he belonged. And then, instead of staying to rule beside him, they walked away. They wanted to build something of their own. That one decision would lead to the bloodiest fight between brothers in history. Eventually, the twins found the perfect spot. A place near the Tiber River, with 7 hills, good land, and a village nearby with fresh water. This was it. This was where they'd build their city. But then, almost immediately, they hit a problem. They couldn't agree on where exactly to put it. Romulus wanted the Palatine Hill. Remus wanted the Aventine Hill. And neither one of them was willing to back down. So instead of just picking one, they decided to let the gods choose. They'd each watch the sky, and whoever saw more birds would get to decide where the city would stand. Remus went first. He counted 6 birds, and he was thrilled. He thought he'd already won. Then Romulus counted 12. Remus was furious. He accused his brother of lying, of cheating, of making the whole thing up. But Romulus wouldn't budge. He said the gods had clearly chosen him, and that was the end of it. So Romulus started building. He marked out the boundary of his new city and began raising a wall around it, right there on the Palatine Hill. Remus wasn't done, though. He wanted to prove a point, so he walked right up to his brother's half-built wall and he jumped over it, just to show how weak it was, just to humiliate him. And Romulus didn't hesitate. He killed his own brother, right there, over a wall that wasn't even finished yet. There are different versions of what he said next, but the message was always the same. This is my city now, and anyone who tries to cross it without my permission will end up exactly like you. And that, right there, is the true founding of Rome, not some noble beginning. A city built on a wall, and on the body of a brother. So now Romulus was king. But there was a problem. Rome, at this point, wasn't really a city. It was just a hill with a wall around it, and one very determined man standing on top of it. To fix that, Romulus made an announcement. He declared Rome an asylum, meaning anyone could come and live there, no questions asked. Runaway slaves, criminals, exiles, debtors, people running from something back home. It didn't matter who you were or what you'd done. Rome would take you in. And it worked. People actually came. Rome started filling up fast. But then Romulus noticed something. Almost everyone who showed up was a man. There were no women, which meant there was no future. No children, no next generation, nothing. So he came up with a plan, and it wasn't a good one. Rome invited their neighbors, a people called the Sabines, to a big festival. Food, music, celebration, the whole thing. And the Sabines showed up with their entire families, because why would you say no to a party? Then, in the middle of it, Romulus gave a signal, and his men grabbed every young Sabine woman they could find and dragged them back into the city. The next morning, the Sabine men woke up furious, and they marched on Rome for war. But right as the two armies were about to clash, the Sabine women themselves ran out into the middle of the battlefield. They begged both sides to stop. These were their fathers on one side and their new husbands on the other, and they didn't want either one to die for this. So the fighting stopped, and instead of staying enemies, the two peoples merged into one, Sabines and Romans, now living together under one king. From there, Rome went through 6 more kings after Romulus. Some built temples, some built roads, some expanded the borders through war. One built the sewer system that Rome still gets credit for today. But a few of them got too powerful, too fast. And that made the wrong people nervous. So more than one king in Rome's early history didn't die of old age. They were murdered by the very men who were supposed to be loyal to them. And then came the 7th king, a man so cruel, so hated, that the people of Rome finally had enough. They rose up and threw him out of the city for good. And after that, they made a decision. No more kings. Not ever again. That's the moment Rome stopped being a kingdom and became something new, a republic. Rome's new plan was simple. No more kings, ever again. So instead of one ruler, they elected 2 consuls at a time. Each one could veto the other, and every year they'd elect new ones. In theory, that meant no single man could ever get too powerful again. For a while, it actually worked. But then Rome ran into the Gauls, from the region we now call France, and Rome lost, badly. The Gauls marched straight into the city, burned most of it down, and only left after Rome agreed to pay them a ransom in gold. That humiliation changed everything. Rome swore it would never happen again. And from that point on, they became one of the most aggressive military powers the world had ever seen. They conquered their neighbors, then Greek colonies, then tribe after tribe, until almost all of Italy belonged to Rome. But then they ran into someone their equal, Carthage. Carthage had money, a massive navy, and something Rome had never faced before: war elephants. The two powers went to war 3 times. Historians call it the Punic Wars. In the first war, Rome didn't even have a real navy, so they built one, using a captured Carthaginian ship as the blueprint. And somehow they won anyway. The Second War is the one people still talk about today, because that's when Hannibal showed up. Hannibal gathered 50,000 men and dozens of war elephants, and instead of attacking Rome the easy way, by sea, he marched his entire army over the Alps, through snow, through freezing terrain, losing men and animals the entire way. And then he crushed Roman army after Roman army on Italian soil for years. Rome came dangerously close to losing everything. But in the end, their sheer size and resources won out. Hannibal was pushed back, and Carthage was defeated again. The Third War wasn't really a war. It was revenge. Rome marched in, burned Carthage to the ground, and erased the city completely. Anyone left alive was enslaved. With their only real rival gone, Rome kept expanding. Spain, North Africa, Greece, parts of the Middle East. There was almost nothing stopping them now. And the man who would push that expansion further than anyone before him was Julius Caesar. Caesar marched into Gaul with a relatively small army, and over the next several years, he tore through it completely. Tribe after tribe fell. He pushed into Belgium, threatened Germany, and even crossed into Britain, just to see what was there. By the time he came back to Rome, he wasn't just a general anymore. He was dangerous, and the Senate knew it. So they ordered him to return alone and to leave his army behind. He refused. Instead, he marched his army straight toward the capital, and the Senate, terrified, fled the city before he even arrived. Caesar still had rivals to defeat before he could truly take control, and it took him years of fighting across the empire to do it. But eventually, he won, and he became the most powerful man Rome had ever seen. Some Romans loved him for it. He fixed the calendar. He lowered taxes. He gave land to soldiers who had served for years and gotten nothing in return. He even started rebuilding the city itself. But others were terrified of him, because piece by piece, Caesar was collecting every major title Rome had to offer: dictator, consul, head priest, all at once. And after 500 years of living in fear of kings, the Senate looked at what was happening and they panicked. So a group of senators made a decision. They murdered Caesar in the middle of a Senate meeting, believing they were saving the Republic. They weren't, because outside that room, the people of Rome didn't see traitors being punished. They saw the man who lowered their taxes and gave them free grain, stabbed to death by the very people who were supposed to protect the Republic. Chaos followed almost immediately. Caesar's closest ally, Mark Antony, tried to seize power for himself. But he wasn't the only one with a claim. Caesar's 18-year-old adopted grandnephew, Octavian, wanted it too. For a while, they ruled together, along with a third man who barely mattered. But it was never going to last. Antony eventually fell for Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and spent more and more of his time there instead of in Rome. Octavian used that against him. He convinced the Roman people that Antony was planning to abandon Rome entirely and move the empire's capital to Egypt. It wasn't true, but people believed it anyway. Rome went to war with Egypt and won. Antony and Cleopatra, facing total humiliation, both took their own lives rather than be paraded through Rome in defeat. And just like that, Octavian was the only one left standing. He renamed himself Augustus, and in the year 27 BC, the Roman Republic officially came to an end. The Roman Empire had begun. Augustus knew exactly why the Republic had collapsed. It wasn't about laws or traditions. It was because Roman armies had stopped being loyal to Rome and started being loyal to whichever general was paying them. So he fixed that first. He turned the army into a proper, professional force. Soldiers now served for a fixed number of years, got paid regularly by the state, and received land and a pension when they retired. Not from a general, from Rome itself. He also made sure no single governor could ever control too much land or too many soldiers at once. Power was spread out deliberately, so no one could rise the way he had. And instead of endless conquest, Augustus focused on securing what Rome already had. Spain was pacified, the Alps were secured, the Danube became a hard frontier. But not every border stayed quiet. In 9 AD, 3 Roman legions marched into Germania, led by a general named Varus. Guiding him, and pretending to be his loyal ally, was a man named Arminius, a man who had actually grown up inside the Roman army, and knew exactly how it worked. Arminius led Varus straight into a trap, deep into the forest, along terrain no Roman army could fight properly in. Then the ambush began. Not a battle, a slaughter. 20,000 Roman soldiers died in that forest. Varus took his own life rather than return to Rome in disgrace. After that, Augustus gave up on conquering Germania entirely. The Rhine became the permanent border, and it stayed that way for centuries. When Augustus died in 14 AD, he left behind something Rome had never truly had before: stability. But that stability didn't last with the men who came after him. Tiberius, the next emperor, became so paranoid of everyone around him that he abandoned Rome completely and ruled from a private island. And that created a dangerous gap, because it let his personal guards, the Praetorian Guard, start controlling access to the emperor and slowly controlling the empire itself. After Tiberius came Caligula, who grew too unstable to control. So the Praetorian Guard simply killed him and picked the next emperor themselves. From that point on, everyone understood the truth. Whoever controlled the soldiers controlled Rome. Not tradition, not the Senate, just force. Nero came next, and his reign ended in fire, financial ruin, and rebellion. When even his own guards turned against him, he took his own life. And Rome fell into a single chaotic year with 4 different emperors, as different armies backed different men for the throne. Eventually one general, Vespasian, won simply because his army was the strongest. Not because he was loved, because he had the power. For decades after, emperors rose and fell the same way, over and over. But Rome still had one final peak left. Under Emperor Trajan, in the year 117 AD, the empire reached its largest size in history, stretching from Britain all the way to the Persian Gulf. It would never be that large again. For the next 100 years, Rome held on. A few good emperors kept things stable, but that stability was fragile, and eventually it cracked. By the 3rd century, Rome was falling apart from the inside. Emperors were being crowned and killed within months of each other. Plagues tore through the cities, the economy collapsed, and on top of all that, enemies were pressing in from every direction at once. Eventually, one emperor, Diocletian, accepted something nobody wanted to admit. Rome had simply become too big to be ruled by one man anymore. So he split the empire into 4 pieces, ruled by 4 different leaders at once. It was meant to make the empire easier to defend, and for a while it did. But it also meant Rome itself stopped being the center of power. The emperors weren't even living there anymore. They were stationed on the borders, where the real fighting was happening. Eventually, one man, Constantine, fought his way to full control again. But instead of moving back into Rome, he built an entirely new capital in the east, a city called Constantinople. It was richer, it was easier to defend, and it was built as a Christian city, in an empire that had spent centuries worshipping different gods entirely. From that point on, Rome, the actual city, slowly became irrelevant. The wealth, the power, the future of the empire, all of it had moved east, and the West was left behind to fend for itself. What finally destroyed the West wasn't a single enemy. It was a chain reaction that Rome could no longer stop. Far to the east, a terrifying group called the Huns began pushing into Europe, and entire nations started fleeing in front of them. One of those nations, the Goths, showed up at Rome's border begging to be let in. Rome allowed it, but Roman officials treated them so badly that the Goths eventually revolted, and a few years later, a Roman army was destroyed, and the emperor himself was killed in the fighting. That single moment taught Rome something it never wanted to learn. Letting people in, without any way to control them, wasn't integration. It was importing a war Rome couldn't win. And the cracks kept spreading. More groups pushed across the border. Rome, weaker every year, started making desperate deals just to survive. Land in exchange for peace. Peace that never lasted. Then North Africa was lost, the region Rome depended on for food and money. And once that was gone, there was almost nothing left to hold the West together. In 410, Rome was sacked for the first time in 800 years. Then again in 455, and by 476, the very last Western emperor was a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus. A name that, looking back, feels almost cruel. Romulus, the same name as the boy who founded Rome over 1,000 years earlier. Augustulus, a small echo of Augustus, the man who once built an empire that ruled the known world. He wasn't killed in some final, dramatic battle. His own Germanic commander simply told him it was over and quietly removed him from power. No war, no last stand, just an empire, ending almost politely. The city that once believed it would rule forever became a memory. But if you think that's where the story of Rome truly ends, it isn't. Because in the East, the empire didn't fall that day. It kept going for another 1,000 years until it finally fell to a very different kind of empire. But that is a story for another day.